Hello, and welcome to the HIPAA Insider Show. I'm your host, Adam Zenadine, and I'm joined by Gil Vidals today. Hey, Gil.
Hey, Adam. Looking forward to today's podcast.
Likewise. So today, stay tuned. We are going to be talking about Google Cloud versus AWS and Azure, which is more HIPAA ready in 2026. Okay, so AWS versus Google Cloud Platform and Azure for 2026. Which is more HIPAA ready? Well, to start out, Gil, I thought what we'd do is we'd go over the platforms a little bit at a high level. And so we're going to start with infrastructure. So AWS has 38 regions, 120 zones, and 700 edge locations. Regions and zones.
So, in the Google Cloud specifically, which is the one I have the most experience with, the zones refer to actual uh, data centers that are contained within regions. So, with regions, you could think of like the West Coast, East Coast, Midwest, and so on. And not just Americas, you also have regions in Europe and Australia and so on. Uh, the zones are going to be the actual data centers. So, within each region, you're going to have these data centers distributed.
Yeah, so the edge locations are actually smaller locations throughout different locales where they'll have we'll have smaller servers and networks to reach more locations, but without having huge, massive data center entities. So it looks like AWS in terms of regions 38 is slightly behind Google Cloud and Microsoft Azure. However, within those regions, you can see the zones are almost exactly identical. So they really, the regions isn't so much the telling number here, it's the zones. AWS has 120, Google Cloud Platform has 121, and Microsoft Azure has 120, which is really interesting because it seems to suggest to me, Gil, that they're keeping an eye on each other and keeping up with each other in terms of these numbers. What do you think?
Right, I agree. I mean, like I said, with Google Cloud, we know that means those zones refer to the data centers they have, and so they're all going to be keeping up with each other, trying to make sure that they keep up with the Joneses, right? They don't want one to outdo the other one.
Yeah, absolutely. But then you do see that AWS clearly in the lead in terms of edge locations. So Google Cloud and Microsoft Azure with a bit of catch up to do there. I think it makes sense given AWS's logistics business. Needing to have connectivity, everywhere. Why they'd have more edge locations with their their depots and things like that. Okay, moving on to the services. So services, let's talk a little bit about what services are within AWS. It would be as opposed to servers, right, Gil?
Yes, the services are a huge factor for these data centers because back in the day it was mainly physical servers, and then it went to virtual, and that's what people were accustomed to using, a virtual server. But since those days, the number of services, Adam, that have taken off are enormous, right? These they have API services and cloud services, storage services, networking services. Everything is a service, and we're talking about thousands and thousands of services.
We'll break these down a little bit and talk about those services. So there's different categories for each type of service. And here what we're listing is HIPAA eligible services. So not all services on these cloud providers do fall under the business associate agreement, but these are the ones listed here that do. Any particular ones that stand out for you? From interesting to see, there's a couple of changes here. AI and ML. This is the area that has had the most innovation over the past year. So AWS with SageMaker, Google Cloud with Vertex AI, and AWS with, Azure Machine Learning. The AI and ML, and from last year, some of the names were different. They were using different services. I know on Google Cloud they've combined the services into one single API or tool, Vertex AI, and so that's a significant change there on the AI side. Any other ones stand out for you?
I think as far as the services go for HIPAA compliance, I know there are more that are out there than what's on this list. And for our audience, I think a good takeaway for them, Adam, is that when you're building your own project within any of these clouds, be sure that if it is going to be requiring HIPAA compliance, that you go to the documentation. They'll have a much more detailed list. And whatever you're building, just literally look it up in the list. If it's not there, and that presents a big problem, you're like, uh-oh, this is not a HIPAA compliant service. You might want to check the other cloud providers. They have very similar services, and maybe theirs is HIPAA compliant. But if it's not on the list, you've got a problem because it's not something you can change. You can't overcome it by simply adding or taking away something that's in the infrastructure layer that you don't have access to. And just like every other kind of software, Adam, the list, this might become HIPAA compliant in the third quarter of the year, or whatever. So you could look at it and say, oh, well, that's fine. We'll be there soon. But anyway, I would look at that. I would not assume that every service that these cloud providers have are certified for HIPAA or FERPA, which is the educational one, or PCI. Whatever you need, look it up and review it first before you lay out the big dollars to start your project.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. This is definitely a summarized list. We did review it and make sure that all of these are up to date. But if you're watching this 6 months from now, who knows, it might have changed. So let's look at cost. Everyone's very interested in looking at cost comparison. So what we did is we took the standard single server Linux virtual machine, 2 CPU, 8 gigs of RAM, and 30 gigabyte disk. And we compared the cost for it, and you'll see AWS and Microsoft Azure, very interestingly, exactly the same price. So
that's true.
And I was like, that can't be right. But I dug into it, and for that particular apples comparison, it is right. So again, I mean, it seems like whoever's doing the cost competitiveness within these companies is really on the money. And then you can see that Google Cloud is clearly the cost leader when it comes to this. So the 20% cheaper almost.
Yeah, I think that's noteworthy to pause there for one moment. The Google is technically very sound. These platforms are all sound. Okay, so when you decide on these platforms, not because one's sound and the other one's unsound, there are other factors to consider. But Google is in third place here on this list. So number one is AWS market share, then Azure, then Google. So Google is playing catch up, and for that reason, they've lowered their pricing to try to attract more business, steal some business from the other guys, and get some of the companies that are really cost conscious to come on board. And that's an advantage because Google's security is excellent. So you're not compromising by paying less. You're getting a good platform.
And security and compliance. This is a really important area for most of our listeners and viewers, Gil. So we've broken this down into 4 categories: data protection, compliance certifications, identity and access management, and threat detection. What are the standout areas for you that maybe one platform has over the other? Because a lot of these seem similar in terms of certification.
Yeah, I think the compliance certifications are all very broad. All of these platforms are going to give you the various certifications you need. FedRAMP is particularly important, Adam, in the last many years for government contracting at the federal level.
So and they all have a FedRAMP.
Yeah, they all have that. And that's super important if you're going to be doing government contracting. So you would want to use that. I think the identity and access management that with Google, you have the advantage that you could use your Google Gmail accounts to authenticate. So you don't, with the other platforms, you authenticate as well with an email account if you want. There's many ways to authenticate, but I like the way they've integrated the Gmail accounts into their IAM, their identity access management, so that you can access the platform. And it seems to just dovetail and work seamlessly with Google, and I like that. Now, Microsoft, you could say the same thing about their Outlook accounts. They have Outlook, and if you're an Outlook shop, then that might be more convenient to use Azure for that reason.
Yeah, it would be interesting to if whether the organization is already a Microsoft organization leads it to host in Azure, and vice versa if it's a Google Workspace based organization, if it goes naturally to Google. Okay, and then the threat detection and response, again, would you say these are fair?
Yeah, I think they're pretty comprehensive. What we're talking about here for the audience sake is a security command center for the administrator of security or compliance managers. They're going to want to access these dashboards. They get a global view, especially if you have thousands of services and virtual machines, containers, it becomes very vast. And so the good news is these platforms have a way of viewing at a high level the security threats, and it gives you suggestions on what you need to change. One simple example might be a network that you spun up for some reason, a subnet that's not being used. It might say, hey, you've got a subnet here that's enabled, but there's no use, there's no systems connecting to it, so why do you have a network just sitting there empty? You should think about shutting it off, reduce your attack vector. So it's doing advice like that to make sure that you haven't over provisioned things or under provisioned security, and if you pay attention to it, it's quite useful.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So we've gone through a couple of different areas there. So when we're looking at the practical realities for what to choose in 2026 in terms of public, it's clear that GCP is the most affordable entry point. But what about like the surrounding ecosystem when we take into account training, talent, and managed service?
I think that the talent pool is something that I'm glad you brought up, because when you're administering a cloud project, you're obviously going to have your developers, engineers, and so on to manage and work on your project. And what I've noticed is that there are many engineers that are experienced or have at least some experience with AWS. I say that one, and it's the largest platform, so there's no surprise there. Now, what does that mean for the audience? Well, if you're going to be developing a project in the cloud, you're going to have a harder time finding people that are Google Cloud certified or that have in-depth experience. It's not unreasonably hard. I'm not suggesting you can't find anyone, but it's not the plethora like with AWS. You have them everywhere, and so you have all kinds too. You have in all three of these, you'll have the beginners, the novices, very experienced, and so on. Now, interestingly enough, I've met a few individuals, Adam, that have the certifications in all three. Like these guys they're real brainy and they've worked for a long time, and they have advanced certifications in all three platforms, which is kind of rare. But you would pay top dollar for that kind of talents. But if you're a big organization and you have a platform that's going to span Azure, AWS, and Google, you might look for one of these unique individuals, and they're out there. I've talked to them and I've worked with them.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think there's a key distinction to be made here between what you're contracting the talent for. So if you predominantly contracting the talent for development purposes, the developer might, because they have to have familiarize themselves with certain public cloud like AWS, but most of the work that they would do on AWS is what's called development operations rather than strict development. So what we generally recommend is if you can segment things and have the developer do the development work and then bring on a managed compliance partner, like HIPAA Vault, then the managed compliance partner can take away a lot of the compliance and security aspects that are part of DevOps, and then the developers can focus on developing the app.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good strategy, Adam, so that your developers aren't having to work with the compliance, and they may fumble that because that's not their strength and that's not where their time is going. Their focus is on the DevOps. So yeah, I think that I agree with you. I think that's
okay. So the final word, 2026, Gil, as we head into the new year, we've still got a month, but we like to get ahead of the game. If you're a small to mid-sized company, a startup, clinic, building a new application that's going to be processing patient information, what's the strategic take?
Well, I'll start on the opposite side. If you're a large enterprise with a large IT footprint, then you're going to need the widest catalog of services, and you're going to prioritize the most mature vendor ecosystem, which is going to be AWS. And then for Google, if you really are prioritizing security, and it's important to you to have an environment where you can work with the default settings, where you can have a platform that's already configured for security, then I think Google Cloud would be easier, because in AWS, some of the defaults you have to play with and look at them and understand them.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of my summary. Yeah, I think for the HIPAA ready posture, I think that a good partner like HIPAA Vault is important, so that you can come into the Google Cloud and have a partner that's ready and has all the knowledge they need to properly configure and manage the environment to ensure it stays HIPAA compliant during the whole life cycle.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, the key message remains: compliance is a responsibility, not a feature. Yeah, and thank you for tuning into the HIPAA Insider.